let's look at how we can deal with validation using exceptions. In our controller, we've got the request coming in. We essentially decode the command. We get the parameter from the request. And then if the command is equal to calculate premium, then we will use the request dispatcher to dispatch this request to the model. So let's take a look at what happens in the model. The model servlet is going to get from the request the user age parameter. Now you can see up here on lines 9 through 11, we've set up some static variables that define the minimum value in the range and the maximum value in the range for age. So age equal to 1 all the way up to age equal to 95 will be considered valid. And then we've got a multiplier for determining the premium, which is a very crude way of determining a premium, of course, but this isn't a real example. So we get the age, store it in its string, but because it comes from getParameter as a string, we store it as a string, but of course we can't do any arithmetic operations on a string, and therefore we need to convert that string age into an integer age. Recognizing that this has come from the user who has typed into a text box, the user could have typed absolutely anything. They might, if we have been lucky, have typed in the character 4 and then the character 5, for example, and therefore the string actually does represent an integer. But on the other hand, they might have just tried, either through ignorance or perverseness, they might have actually tried to break your program and have entered something completely different, like hello, instead of some other useful data. So we have to guard against that kind of situation. So we validate. The first thing we've got to do is to try to parse that string to make sure that it is an integer value. Now, integer.parseInt, if we put ourselves there and do a control spacebar, we can see that this method could potentially throw a number format exception. Therefore, executing the statement here could throw that exception. And recognizing that, we're going to put that statement inside this try block. At the end of the try block, we then have a catch block for catching number format exceptions. And so we put the class number format exception and then a name for the parameter. If that exception is thrown, it will be caught here, and our response is simply going to be to throw a new servlet exception with the message age error, the age is not an integer. We know that that is a safe message to output because the only way number format exception could have occurred is because this parse of that string failed to produce an integer. Now, why have we included the rest of these statements inside the try block? Because if we had put them, instead of having them there, if I cut it out of there and paste it down here, then the try will have caused the number format exception to be thrown. It will have been caught here, and actually in this example, because we're then throwing another exception, bang, out of the servlet we go. But if we'd have done something else, some other kind of processing there that doesn't abort the servlet, then after the catch block, execution would continue. And we're then trying to use age OK, which won't be correct, and we'll be trying to use a value here for age that has not been set. So that's not a desirable thing to do. Therefore, we put those statements inside the try block, knowing that should this line produce the exception, these will not be executed. Turned on its head, we do also know that those statements will be executed if and only if the string held in age str represents an integer. So let's have a look at this then. We're now doing a bit of validation. That is a Boolean expression, age greater than or equal to minimum age. This is also a Boolean expression, age less than or equal to minimum age, and with the logical operator AND, we now have a complex Boolean expression that will evaluate to true or false. Because of the AND, it will only evaluate to true if age is both greater than or equal to minimum age and less than or equal to maximum age. That evaluates to true or false, and therefore we can store in that Boolean variable a value that is true or false, and then we can test it. If not age OK, in other words, if age OK was set to false, then we're going to throw in a servlet exception with the message that the age is not in the range minimum to maximum. So you can see that we're able to throw different exceptions. Only one of them, of course, will be thrown because it aborts the servlet. But we can send out throw an exception with a customized message that will then be used later on for producing a meaningful message for the user. Now, if this condition is false, that means that age OK has the value true, and therefore the integer or the string has been converted to an integer, and that integer is in the range minimum to maximum, therefore is valid. So we can process it. And in this very simple example, the way that we're processing it is to set a request scope attribute called premium, and the value is going to be age times multiplier. So this servlet will terminate in one of two ways. Either it will terminate normally, having set this premium attribute on the request scope, or it will terminate with a servlet exception in one of these two locations. So when we come back into the controller, having dispatched the request to the model, the next thing that happens will depend on how the model servlet has terminated. If it terminated normally, we just simply go straight ahead to do the normal view. And that view will get hold of the premium attribute from the request scope and use that to format some kind of output. And you can have a look at that in your own time at some point. On the other hand, the model servlet might have terminated with the throwing of a servlet exception. And therefore, we put that statement inside a try catch. This time, what we're looking out for are servlet exceptions. So if the model servlet throws a servlet exception, it will be caught here at line 27, and then we can detect what kind of error we've got. If we have a quick look back into the model, we can see that by design, we've started each of those error messages with age error colon, age error colon. Therefore, in here, in the controller, we can test to see if the message for that servlet exception, so there's the parameter name, SE, servlet exception, there's a method in there called getMessage that will return the string that was set in here, age error blah blah blah, age error blah blah blah. So that string there is what is returned by getMessage. And because it's a string, we can convert that to lowercase and check then to see if it starts with the string age error. If it does, then we know that this servlet exception was generated by our model component, and therefore we can process it by setting on the request scope an attribute called ageException, and then dispatching the request to the error view. And then the error view will pick up the ageException attribute by calling getAttribute from the request scope, typecasting it to a servlet exception, because we know that's what it is, and storing it in here, so that we then can make use of the method getMessage. And whatever message was set by the model component will then be displayed as part of the view. That's how we can validate in a servlet and use exceptions to report the errors. And then the controller is at liberty simply to assume everything will happen normally. So invoke the model component, then invoke the normal view, put that in a try block, and if a servlet is thrown, we can detect what's happened and invoke the error view. I've got an else down here because if it's not a servlet exception that starts with age error, then the exception has been for some other problem that we've not thought about, and therefore we're simply just going to throw that, and this servlet container will deal with it by spitting out horrible things for the user to see. But if we've done our testing properly, then maybe they won't see that because we will have detected it. And then we can start to build in other kinds of servlet exceptions We can perhaps detect other things here, throw servlet exceptions with other kinds of error messages that we then can pick up in here in that if by putting in an else if. So that's how we can do the validation and handling of errors using exceptions.